Firstly is Accelerate Resources, which is focused on the Mount Read Cobalt project in Tasmania. To present for Accelerate Resources is Executive Director Andrew Haythorpe. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, ResourceStocks, ladies and gentlemen. We have a very simple, short story for you today. We're a company that's about 2 months old. We listed on the ASX only in February, so we're just literally getting started. Having said that, we're already drilling, and I've got some interesting things to show you today. We are focused on cobalt. It is in Tasmania. It's actually a part of Tasmania which I didn't really appreciate existed myself, going back as a geologist even, and that is there's an area on the west coast which some of you be familiar. It's very prospective, and in fact it hosts most of the major mining operations in Tasmania and some of the great ones in Australia. It's called the Mount Read Volcanics as the geological unit. Most of it occurs from Queenstown, sort of Renison Bell, northwards up towards Savage River and towards Burnie. But there is a block that's sort of been overlooked, if you like, or almost forgotten, to the south of Macquarie Harbour. We're very fortunate to have 100% ownership of what I think is one of the great provinces for metals discoveries in the world that remains today in a reasonably civilised part of the world. So I'll talk a little bit more about Tasmania shortly. But I guess one of the highlight areas, certainly the focus of our current work and where the drill rig's currently situated, is in that sort of orange spot in the middle that you can see there with Thomas Creak, if you can make out the label name there. And that's a 2 kilometre by 2 kilometre area that's defined by geophysics and geochemistry, and it looks very interesting, so we are drilling there. Further to the north, or heading up towards the top of the page, there's a couple of other spots up there called Henrietta, which again, nickel cobalt. Prospects in those cases, and I'll show you a little bit more about them shortly. So we're very much focused on we call it the Mount Read Cobalt Project, but in fact there's already 3 projects presenting themselves to us, and in fact there's even more targets coming up as we do more work as we move forwards. Just to sort of mention a few names for those of you who are not familiar, that southern area that I mentioned just south of the harbour there, indicated on the map to the right. The next thing close to us is actually Mount Lyell copper mine, which was discovered about 140 odd years ago, about to reopen actually after a closure, but it still has 300 million tonnes of just under 1% copper with gold and in fact cobalt as well at Mount Lyell. And what we're seeing in our property at Thomas Creek looks very much like an exploration analogue to that. And further up from Mount Lyell, Renison Bell, Hellier, Savage and other names, Henty Gold Mine. So to say that's a good address or a good province is an understatement. A lot of people have had difficult or challenging experiences as investors or working in Tasmania. There's been 30 years of green movement and history. My observation is those 30 years have pretty well run their course. Certainly in the west coast of Tasmania, it's much more of a mining community like what we see in West Australia or the coalfields of Queensland perhaps, or the Mount Isa area. So the mindset is let's get on and do work. And they've had not one but a full generation, some 30 years of massive underemployment on the west coast of Tasmania now. And our sense meeting with and joining in with the locals last year is they're pretty well fed up with underemployment and seeing all of their younger generations move onto the mainland and overseas. And the Tasmanian government actually has preserved the area that we're in as a strategic investment zone, if you like, for forestry and mining. So the brown areas are the bits that the Tassie government set aside to actually create industry. The grey areas is basically for everyone else, so to speak, in terms of heritage listings, national parks and so on. So the Tasmanian government has enshrined that in legislation for some decades, and we're basically taking the approach that we're here to explore and to help where we can. More specifically, the Thomas Creek, that area I drew your attention to in the earlier slide, the work that we've done has been focused really on that big red blob in the middle. In fact, that's a 3-dimensional image of an IP anomaly that's about roughly 400 by 600 metres by 200 metres deep. I tried to do some maths, and that's about the volume of 3 Melbourne cricket grounds, just to try and give you a visualisation of how big that area is. We're on drill hole number 2. We're sitting about 120 metres, and the drill rig, as best as we know, is turning as I'm speaking here to you today. Those little white dots there in the red are the drill hole collars, and the black lines are the traces down. Drill hole number 3 is the next one coming up shortly. The yellow dots and the red dots define the surface, which is where the copper cobalt geochemistry is. And our job is basically to find something of commercial significance inside that red area. The smaller red blobs to the edges are actually smaller only because we've touched onto those about a month ago in our initial survey, which has clearly indicated not just geophysics and more anomalies around the edges there in the magnetic zone, which is that big grey sort of bucket shape, but also we have geochemistry, and I actually have a few photos of a few rocks. The photo on the right-hand side is a pan concentrate of sulphides, which we literally dug out of the mud with a shovel in October last year, and one of those little red spots on that red blob. So there's certainly the potential to host a Mount Lyell type ore body there, or something else that's even more interesting perhaps. And just to look at that magnetic feature again, more for the geotechnically minded perhaps, the white and pink is now coloured for the magnetic anomaly that goes around the edge, and the reddy orangey colour down in the bottom centre is that IP anomaly area, and then all the little dots dotted around are indicative of previous geochem sampling. And if you go right up to the very top left-hand corner, you might be able to see a few red dots up there. You might be able to see some red dots to the right-hand side on that white zone. You might see some more red dots down towards where the word surface IP anomaly is written. Basically what we're finding each day that we go out and explore around these areas, we're simply finding more mineralisation at surface, and that's outside of our drilling activity. I haven't seen anything quite this prolific in many years of being in the industry. And when we drill it, that's a shot from the drill core from last week from drill hole number 1. That's being packaged up as we speak and sent off to Perth to then get some work done at ALS to see what we might have in that in terms of copper, cobalt and gold mineralisation. But that's basically our primary sort of search target, is looking for massive sulphides or sulphide accumulations in these areas. And it's the sulphide, whether it's chalcopyrite or pyrite, that hosts the cobalt, which is the good stuff. For those of you familiar with cobalt marketing would know traditionally or historically over the last 100, 200 years anyway, most cobalt is sold as a co-product of either nickel concentrate or copper concentrate, and then that goes off to the smelters and refineries to produce nickel and copper, of course, but out of that also comes cobalt. So metallurgically we're looking very, very encouraging. So really what we're looking for are thick accumulations of exactly that material that we've already drilled last week. Just to move on to the other two prospects that I touched on earlier, I did mention there was 3. To the south, or the bottom of that page, is the Thomas Creek area that we've just spent a moment on. But further to the north, and you could probably just make out some boxes and some numbers and some lines. What we actually have is the highlighted white and colourful bands are actually ultramafics as defined by Aeromag. And then along those Aeromag there's a couple of pink lines, and the pink lines, one of them is about 1.2, 1.4 kilometres long. It's actually a consistent EM conductor anomaly sitting next to one of the Aeromag anomalies. The other one's a smaller, more discrete 200 metre long feature. They're VTEM anomalies, and that's one of the primary exploration techniques especially used around the world for finding nickel cobalt sulphides. So we're very keen to get out there and follow those up. Both of these anomalies, 200 metres and 1.2 kilometre long, have never been drilled. However, a geologist did manage to get on the ground there a few years ago, took a few rock chips and a few samples and got significantly elevated cobalt and nickel in very interesting grade ratios. We're hoping to have the drill rig out, subject to weather and everything, inside a month or two, drilling those targets for the first time. With those scales, even though 200 metres might sound quite small, when you're talking nickel and cobalt ore bodies, it's potentially quite large. And just to look at those in 3-dimensional schematic, the little one there we're calling Young Henry, the 200 metre long one, and the bigger one over 1 kilometre long. It's a very simple exercise for us to, a lot of work I might say, but a simple exercise once you're there to poke some drill holes into it. And again, one of the attractive features is, so far as we know, again, like what we've seen at Thomas Creek, we're talking about mineralisation that subcrops or sits at 50 centimetres or a metre's depth. So we could be doing some very quick and shallow drill holes into that 20 metre, 40 metre, 50 metre intercepts, something of that scale. subject to doing a bit more work in terms of the geophysics. So again, any one of these projects has the opportunity for us to grow as a company significantly. So drilling underway. When we did a roadshow late last year, probably 80% of people said you can't drill in Tasmania or you can't do anything in Tasmania. Well, 3 months later we're doing it. I always love a good skeptic or underdog story. We do have some projects and properties in West Australia as well, but I see we are getting on time. Ladies and gentlemen, well, thank you very much for your time and attention, and thank you again to ResourceStocks. Very much appreciated.